Good evening, everyone. This is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and today we're going to do our first show dedicated only to viewers' questions. So I'm going to try to actually go through every single question that was asked up to this point. So hang on. I won't answer all of them as fully as the questioner might like, but at least we'll get through quite a lot of them this way. Okay, so the first one comes from Nazertep, which is Petrosian backwards. And he asks me to explain moments when memory of a game or position I had studied directly helped me in an actual game, not counting theoretical endgames or openings. Well, what I'm going to do by way of answering this is to present actually kind of a couple of light games. So this first one is a game that I played against actually an 1800 of all things. So this is a game 25 played in the Manhattan Chess Club back in 1998. And I'm going to start from, let's see, maybe around here. Okay, so I'm white in this position, and I certainly have a nice advantage in kingside space, while my opponent, of course, would like to be able to get some counterplay on the queenside, but it's not that easy to achieve. Alright, so here I played bishop to g7. My opponent played knight to e7, and this, I think, is a mistake because it's weakening the f6 square. So I played knight b to d2, taking further control over the b3 square and simply developing, maybe waiting for him to castle also. He played queen c7, and now I thought up, let me get rid of all of the arrows here, I'll create them anew for you. Realized that with this idea of h6, that I can exploit a weakness of the pawn on h7, and in fact this works very nicely. So I played h6, bishop f8, bishop f6, and then knight to g5. And I don't think I'd ever seen this idea before. Maybe I had, I'm not sure, but this is kind of an interesting little dynamic. And so I'm just going to play knight takes h7, retreat the knight back out, and run the h-pawn until it collects lots and lots of goodies. And this works to perfection. So my opponent realizes that if, with normal play, he's just dead lost here, and tries something very interesting. So he plays knight f5. And alright, first of all, the idea is just to grab the h-pawn while it's still on h6. But I realized that, okay, I can just play g4, because if he plays knight takes h6, I simply play knight takes h7. And the threat to take the bishop on f8, followed by the knight on h6, is decisive. So, realizing this, he played knight takes d4, and the rest of this just requires some accuracy and alertness, but nothing more. So c takes d4, c3, knight f3, that way on c takes b2, which he played, queen takes b2, knight c4, queen e2, bishop b4, check, king f1, a5, so he's aiming to play bishop to a6 and try to cause a little trouble for me on this diagonal, so I just get out of the way. King g2, bishop a6, and now finally I get to return to my original plan. Knight takes h7, knight a3, queen d1. Again, everything is covered. Even if he brings his queen into c3, which he does now, queen c3. Oops. I'm still completely fine. Everything's protected. Knight h to g5 makes it even more so, and simultaneously clears the path for the h-pawn. So king d7, h7. He plays rook h8, which lets me win two exchanges, or actually the exchange and a rook. So takes, knight f7, rook over, takes, and my opponent's clearly a bit of a bitter ender here. This is certainly a thoroughly decisive material advantage, but he's a skeptic. Bishop to d3, rook c1. Let's bring all of the pieces into the action. Knight c2. Bishop b1, so I'm happy to trade, or better yet, win more material. Bishop b4, bishop c2, bishop f3, queen f3, queen takes d4. Okay, two rooks and a pawn up, and with the mating attack to boot, my opponent finally resigned. Alright, so the key idea here, though, that was finding this h6, bishop f6, knight g5, and go for the h-pawn idea. Okay, next game. So this is a blitz game of all things, and I'm black against an international master. So this is some 3-0 game played about a year and a half later on ICC. Okay, So my opponent played g3, and this is 3-minute chess, so I played h5. It's actually not that bad. I mean, this is playable. I don't think I would recommend this as the absolute best possible way to meet this g3 opening, but it's playable. I don't think white should get more than a slight advantage at best against it, and certainly for blitz you can play it. So bishop to g2. Maybe white should even consider h4, but he played the more principled bishop to g2. I played h4, and okay, just make some moves here. b3, e5, bishop b2, knight c6. Now here, it's not really that great an idea for me to try to win the pawn. So bishop takes c6, bishop e5, queen d5. So I'm hitting the bishop and the rook, forcing knight to f3, bishop g4, so again threatening the take, and then grab the bishop, so say bishop to b2, h takes g3, taking advantage of the pin here, f takes g3, castles, and certainly black has tremendous compensation here for the pawn. Great activity, the bishop pair, white's king is going to have a difficult time finding a safe way to castle. So my opponent was right to reject this gambited pawn and played c4. Now I played bishop to c5. Here maybe he can take, so I think black still has compensation after bishop c6, dc6, bishop e5, knight f6. So the threat is to take on f2 and then play knight to g4 check and regain the bishop on e5. And again, the bishop pair, white's king is going to take a while to find safety. I mean, maybe it's just going to be best sitting in the center, but I think black is okay here. Certainly for a blitz game, so I'm being a little bit glib, but I think certainly for the blitz context it's fine. Anyway, my opponent played e3. I played knight f6, sacking the pawn a third time, and my opponent again rejects it and plays knight to e2. All right, well now that he's played knight e2, h3, bishop f1, and of course along these lines I remembered the idea that I had used in the earlier game. So see if you can figure out what black to play should do. What's the best way for black to handle this position? Okay, well, you might be thinking that the way to go is to play either d6 or d5, and then bishop g4, bishop f3, knight g4, and so on. And that would certainly be a reasonable way to proceed, and it's, of course, the idea that I had discussed. However, I found a more interesting way to do it, I think. I played b5. Now, what's the point of this? Well, I'm trying to save some time here. So I want to get my bishop on that diagonal, but if I could do it even more quickly, so much the better. And the point is that after c takes b5, well, why not? I play knight to b4, and now I'm threatening mate in one move with knight to d3. At first glance, it looks as if my opponent's move, d4, really puts kind of a screeching halt to my ambitions because, of course, he stops the mate, he attacks the bishop, he attacks the pawn on e5, all kinds of good stuff. But bishop to b7, so I don't have to stop just yet and deal with my bishop on c5. I can continue my attacking idea. All right, so he plays rook to g1, and now we don't let him breathe for a second here. Knight to g4. So, of course, if he takes the bishop, I play knight takes h2, threatening knight to f3 mate. Let's say he plays f4 to give himself a flight square. Knight f3 check, knight takes the rook on g1, and then the threat of h2, h1 leaves black with a winning position. Therefore, after knight to g4, my opponent played f4, kind of preemptively giving his king a flight square. But now I switch directions. Played knight takes e3. He saves his queen. I check. King to f2. And now one of my all-time favorite mates, this. So knight goes back to g4. And surprisingly enough, this is checkmate. So only 14 moves. One of my favorite blitz games that I've played. So anyway, we see the same kind of idea, and this served to inspire the b5 trick and worked to perfection. All right, so not the most serious game in the world, but and interestingly, it's not something that I'd studied per se, except to the extent that I had reviewed my own game. But it was just an idea that I had come up with, or that I had, let's say, investigated at an earlier moment that paid off later on. And this should be the case for all of us. I mean, we don't have to just learn from from books, but we should learn from our own games, from studying them, from reflecting on them, and it pays off. Okay, so the next question comes from Bucketman. So he asks, as a FIDE master playing in tournaments, how often do you know or deliberately make big efforts to study your opponent's preferred openings before going into the game? Do you often play completely blind in this area? Also, have you ever seen an obvious hole in an opponent's repertoire and used it to win in very short order? Does the ubiquity of databases now mean that no one can hide anymore? Well, to answer the first question, of course. I think just about everyone does this. I mean, if you have the opportunity to look up your opponent's preferred openings, or if you simply know the player, then yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've done this my whole life, really. And certainly most club players that I know, if they have the chance to steer the game in a certain direction, they'll do that as well. And yeah, I mean, with databases, it just makes it that much easier. And of course, it goes both ways. And sometimes you try to provide a little disinformation as well when possible. So there were a number of years where I wasn't playing, and the games in the databases were basically really, really old, or occasionally they were from online blitz tournaments, or rapid tournaments anyway. And in those events, I was playing just all kinds of rubbish, and most of that stuff is something, are openings that I would never play in a slow game. So yeah, to answer the question, absolutely. Now, kind of a fun story. I mean, there was when I was growing up, there was a player who was an expert, and I think I was an expert, becoming a master at this point. And we played just a whole slew of games, and there were at least 2 occasions where the player who got a book first in the mail, we'd both ordered the same books, the player who got the book first won. And in particular, I remember a game where we played this perennial variation of the Sicilian knight over with bishop to g5. So the line with bishop g5, and white ends up playing f5, f6, and then rook to g1. Super sharp variation, and at that point, it was still in the relatively early stages. But even now, I mean, there's all kinds of interesting developments that go on there from time to time. At any rate, in the then current issue of The Informant, black had been okay in the last major game in that variation. So it turned out that I got the next Informant a couple of days before he did, and there was a big hole in the line from the previous Informant, and so I knew what it was. He didn't. We raced through almost 30 moves. I made the new move. He shot me a glance. We followed the theory for 2, 3, maybe 4 more moves, and then he was just lost, and I won pretty easily from that. So that doesn't really usually, that's not usually the case, that you get to just win such a game automatically. But it can happen, and I have had that experience before. Okay, next question from Rags to Rooks. So he says, often when a player is worse in a position, annotators and commentators state something to the effect, he should complicate the play. What does that really entail? I assume one way is to keep as many pieces as possible on the board. What are some other ways, what are some other things you can try to mix up the position and give yourself a chance to win, or draw or win the game? Okay, well, I mean, that's essentially what you want to do by complicate. I mean, yeah, you want to avoid exchanges, but you try to make the position more tactical. Also, another thing you want to do is try to create more imbalances. So if your opponent's playing on one side of the board, maybe you try to stir up some trouble on the other side of the board or in the center. Another example, let's say you're in an endgame where both sides have a bishop and a knight. One thing that can sometimes be useful is to try to swap a pair of minor pieces, but to swap opposite minor pieces. So, give up a bishop for a knight or a knight for a bishop. So that way, again, there's some kind of imbalance, something you can try to use. So, various things like that. But I'll give an example of complicating from one of my own games. So this is a game I played in the World Open back in 1998 from the first round. And I had a reasonable position earlier in this game, but I made a sacrifice. You can see the bishop on a3. It ripped off a pawn there, one that I was hoping he wouldn't have the guts to take, but he did. It took him a good long think before he finally ripped it off, but he did. And ultimately at this point, white has very little compensation. So I'm down a pawn, my center is collapsing, And if, let's say, I play something like, I don't know, knight to a4, he takes, queen g5, d4, bishop c1, bishop d6, and okay, the computer that I used at the time to when I analyzed this, after of course doing my own analysis many years ago, this was what the computer came up with for white, but basically white has fairly poor compensation. I mean, some, maybe enough for one of the pawns, but not enough for two of them. So at any rate, here I realized that, okay, with normal play, I'm just in big trouble. I mean, if I play e takes f6, he swaps queens, plays g takes f6, and then gets ready to play e5, d4, and so on. So I found a way to really randomize the position. Rook takes d5. Now, objectively, this is inadequate, and I'll leave it to you to figure out why it's inadequate. It's a good little analytical exercise for you. But that's not really the point, wondering whether this is sound or not. The point is that it very dramatically changes the character of the game. And if he takes the rook, I play knight takes d5, and he's got to be careful. So, for instance, queen to a5, knight to b6 check. Let's say king to d8, rook to d1, piling up on this bishop on d7, rook e7, e takes f6, gf6, queen f6, and black is just losing everything here. So I'm threatening to play rook takes d7 because the rook on e7 is pinned. I'm threatening to take the rook on h8, and it's just not any fun for black anymore. So with rook takes d5, I mean, I'm really making things kind of squirrely for him, especially as time pressure was approaching. And although objectively this should hasten my defeat, it gives me chances. It makes all the results possible. Whereas if I just played e takes f6, my opponent would, maybe if he really screws up, give me a draw, but I have no winning chances at all. I mean, short of just a colossal blunder. And it's the kind of position where it's fairly hard for black to blunder. So rook takes d5, as I said, I may lose much more quickly, but now my opponent has losing chances as well. All right, so he played f takes e5, which seems reasonable. Getting rid of, he's taking another pawn, and now both my queen and the rook are in pre. But I played queen to a4. So if he takes, I play knight takes, and all right, again, black has some resources here. I'll leave him to you to find out, preferably without the use of a computer. If you use a computer, there's no challenge whatsoever. But I'm threatening knight c7, I'm threatening queen a3. In some positions, I'm threatening knight to b6 check. So this is, again, a position where black has to be kind of careful. So my opponent again tried a little intermediate move before taking the rook. So he saves his bishop and attacks my knight. But now, okay, actually I have two good moves here. Rook takes c5 is objectively the best move. But I played rook takes d7. And here maybe he should play queen takes d7, but he played king takes, and now knight e4. Okay, so now my pieces are all extremely active. His king is not especially well placed, though it can go back to c8, which is what he does. But now I play c3, and all of a sudden his bishop is trapped. And when I capture the bishop, then I'm doing fight on material. My pieces are beautifully posted, and in fact I'm just winning here. So the game finished quickly. Rook h to f8, queen a2, rook to b1 would also win. And here, okay, he should probably just take, rook f3, and now queen f7. But after queen e2, I'm winning. So I'm up a piece, and he doesn't really have enough by way of compensation, either in pawns or in kingside counterplay. But instead of taking, he played rook takes f3 straight away. I played gf, and now he played queen f7. Of course, the difference between these two lines is that my knight isn't on c3, and so after knight to d6 check, he resigned. So we can see that in a very short space of time. I mean, the rook takes d5 back here. This was move 18, and the game ended on move 25 with knight to d6 check. So by randomizing the position, again, I could have lost 7 moves later, but it turned out that it was my opponent who did. So this gives, I think, a good example of what's up here and what complicating the game looks like. All right, another question from the same person, a follow-up. He says, another related question is that there are times in the game when you're worse and it is worthwhile trying a tactical trick or two to swindle your opponent. If he or she sees the same trick, You only lose more quickly, but the end result doesn't change. How could you possibly determine the probability that your opponent has seen the same trick or not? Well, I mean, you can't. I mean, it depends on the opponent. I mean, if the opponent is at least as strong as you are, chances are they've seen it. But, you can check out their body language. I mean, have they relaxed? Have they already kind of clicked the point off mentally? I mean, I would say you don't want to try a trick that has a concrete and clear refutation unless you're really just dead lost. I mean, if you're just dead lost, then you can try anything. But if you're not yet dead lost, then you shouldn't do something like that unless you really think that there's a good chance, as far as you can tell, that they'll fall for it. Okay, well, let's move on to a different sort of question here from Guitar Cameron. He says that his relative strength in chess is tactics and feeling at home in funny and cluttered positions, whereas he can't seem to play strategic positions properly. Well, okay, first thing I want to say is that every position is a strategic position, and I mean, unless it's just all calculation, but very few positions are completely random. I mean, even the Najdorf Sicilian and the Dragon Sicilian has all kinds of strategic elements to it. Okay, he goes on to say that he figures that what he said is true because his 960 rating is about 300 points higher rated than his regular Blitz rating. So he says if only he could steer his regular games into these complicated positions, things might go better. And wants to know, what openings he might try where he can get messy positions, but not have to memorize a lot of theory, and of course not have the opening be bad. Well, and would you like your Christmas present now as well? So, the tough thing is, of course, if there are such openings, then they're going to be played by everybody. So what I would say really is this, and this is just general advice. I think it's not a bad thing to learn a little bit of theory. You'd be surprised how little theory you generally need to master. All right, I mean, if you're playing a grandmaster, then you need to know some theory. And you should know some theory, even against, let's say, a master. But the point is, it doesn't have to usually be a tremendous amount. I mean, very few people really need to be theory slaves. Furthermore, I would say that if you do put in your time, I mean, there's a learning curve to these sharp and complicated openings. If you're going to play some kind of mainline Sicilian or the French defense, okay, that's a great opening for getting messy positions in many lines. If you play the winnower variation, for example, or the McCutcheon variation, you will have to learn some stuff. But the thing is, if you take that time to learn it and understand it, so it's not really that you have to memorize a bunch of stuff like a zombie. I mean, that's actually quite rare. All right, I mean, there are some systems, some very ultra-sharp mainline Najdorfs. So in 6 bishop to g5 Najdorfs, that often has to be the case. But not always. And in fact, the last game of the Anand-Kramnik match, Kramnik was playing on his own from about move 9 or 10 and, was okay against even the world's best player. So, know some theory, take the time to learn it, but when you do that, you come to understand the positions really well. And the other thing is that most of your opponents will have the same view. So they'll avoid this or they'll play really badly for the same reason. They're afraid of being some kind of theory zombie, so they just play these openings really, really poorly. Once you know a little bit, you will win a disproportionate amount of games. Okay. Oops. Let's see. All right. So on to another question here. So this is from King Hunter, who asks about a certain line of the French. So let's get to the position in question. So it's the Alekhine-Chittard gambit, and he wants to know about this move knight to f4. Excuse me. And he finds this move a little bit hard to understand. So why does white play knight to f4? It seems to be an unusual square in his opinion. What are the strategic implications of this? Well, the point of the knight on f4, in fact, the knight on f4 is really excellent. So let me get rid of that. And there are several things that it does. One thing is that it takes aim on this pawn on d5. And there could be some variations where white sacrifices a piece there, depending, of course, on how if you can do anything with c7 as a follow-up. But that kind of tactic does sometimes appear. Secondly, um, there can be pressure against g6. How would this work? Well, let's say black castles, bishop to d3. All right, so already we have some pressure against this point. And on g6, okay, we can see that there might be some real pile-ups against this spot here. I mean, I don't know that rook h7 and queen h5 is going to work just yet, but there could be some lines where something to that effect does occur. Maybe queen to g4, and you can see, I mean, there's this massive attack on all of these weak light squares in black's camp. So white is really ready to go here. All right, one other idea behind the knight on f4 is that sometimes I can go to h5 and maybe eye the f6 square as another possibility, especially if the black knight leaves d7 after, for example, something like c5, dc5, knight c5. So there are quite a number of ways in which this knight on f4 can prove to be very well placed. So it gets out of the way, it clears the h-file, it eyes d5, it can go to h5, and it can be involved with pressure on g6. One other idea showing this pressure on g6 business, let's say black plays a6. Okay, and this might seem artificial, but in fact it's kind of sensible, because on c5, maybe black has to worry about knight to b5, and eyeing both the d6 and c7 squares. So let's suppose black plays a6, bishop to d3. Okay, now of course black can't castle, but if he were to play g6, well, then it's quite possible that we have bishop takes g6, and after f takes g6, knight g6. All right, so there's yet another possible exploitation of the knight on f4. Okay, so that's I think that should answer that question. Next one from Ratiodoro. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. The gentleman's real name is Rodrigo. Okay, so he wants to know, when should you or shouldn't you exchange in the center in positions with pawns for both sides? What kind of position is advantageous to relieve the pressure exchanging? And I just have to say that that's, I am afraid, just really too general a question. I mean, there really isn't any kind of hard and fast rule. I mean, I'll try to suggest maybe some broad ideas. If you have, let's say, the more advanced center, so let's actually go back to this French. Okay, knight c3. Well, white doesn't want to exchange in the center most of the time because then it would be balanced. So, the exchange variation is pretty lame, precisely because now the pawn structure in the center is symmetrical. In fact, it's symmetrical everywhere, and so white gets no space advantage at all. Whereas after a move like knight c3, well, he does. Okay, now black, let's say, plays bishop to b4. Well, again, there's pressure on this pawn here. And sometimes white takes. I mean, that's been played before, but the main line is e5. And there are also some variations where white tries to maintain the pawn on e4 with, for example, knight to e2, and then on d takes e4 to play a3. So, if you have the space advantage, then it behooves you most of the time to try to keep the pawn tension, if resolving it means that you're kind of balancing things out in the center. But there are all kinds of reasons why you would make exchanges. I mean, it may clear a line. So if white wanted to get an open line for the bishop going to d3, well, that might be a reason to take on d5. If he could use the open e-file, if the situation was such that that were really useful, well, that would be another reason to make the exchange. So, it really varies. I mean, and there's so many openings where there's some kind of fundamental pawn tension in the center where both players have to decide what to do, that you really just have to take it one opening or maybe one variation at a time. And even there it can vary. So, okay, on to the next question. From King Hunter again. Yeah, let me just suggest, just so I can get through more people's questions. I mean, if you've asked one already, then, wait until another show before asking a new one. But okay, I'll try to get through all of them, as I said. So King Hunter asks, one thing that should be interesting for most amateurs would be an overview of openings in which a bishop is exchanged for a knight. For example, the exchange variation in the French. I think he means the exchange winnower. So again, e5, e5 bishop takes c3 later on there. or the Nimzo-Indian. The strategical aspects of these openings and some examples of wrong exchanges of the bishops on a knight could be very instructive. Well, again, the thing is that, like the previous question, I mean, it's so incredibly general that it's not really all that helpful to discuss it. I will say a couple of things though about these exchanges. So one is that the exchange of a bishop for a knight is usually done for one of two main reasons. One is to achieve some kind of structural advantage, and the other is to gain a temporal advantage. So, for example, let's take a look at the Trompowsky here. All right, so bishop to g5, and okay, white will take on f6. So if black plays d5, for instance, white will generally play bishop takes f6 here. And whichever way black recaptures, white gets a little something out of it in the process. So g takes f6 makes kind of a messy kingside structure for black, but also maybe some chances for nice play in the center. On the other hand, e takes f6 tends to be a little bit more stable, but gives white a fuller center. So let's say e takes f6, e3, and then white will often follow up with c4 at some moment. And this not only gives white a structural advantage, but also gives him a little bit of a central preponderance of space too. So that would actually be a third reason. So structure, space, and time. So going back to bishop to g5, okay, black will sometimes play e6, and here a popular approach for white is e4. So white grabs some space and has to take, because if bishop h4, g5, and he loses the e pawn. So bishop f6, queen f6, and white has this nice pawn center. He'll have a lead in development because black's queen usually has to retreat. Black's bishops have a difficult time really finding ideal squares, especially, well, both of them really, but, well, we'll just stop it at that point. So white's going to have a time advantage and a space advantage, but black's structure is fine, and if he can slowly but surely neutralize white's space and time advantages, then he can look forward someday to using those bishops favorably. So, as I said, lots of possible reasons, and again, it's just so opening specific that it's not really, I think, worth speaking too generally about it. But those would be the three basic reasons why one would legitimately exchange a bishop for a knight in the opening. Okay. Next question, this is from Erod, 1288. What things should one look for when deciding on pawn breaks? Again, this goes back, I think, to what we were discussing about exchanging in the center. There are so many different places where pawn breaks can come into play that it's really, again, difficult to say something about it in the abstract. I mean, generally, you're doing it to either gain space, to alter the structure in some way, or to create open lines. So those would be the three basic occasions where you would look for some kind of pawn break, and bear that in mind if you're in a position where it's hard to make further progress. I mean, that's another point too. I mean, you may reach a position where your pieces have kind of achieved their maximum. What else can you do? Well, you have to create some kind of new lines, and usually pawn breaks are the means by which that occurs. But again, I mean, it's almost impossible to find a chess game without a pawn break. So, what can you say about them in the abstract? Again, I would say really just what I said earlier, that it has three typical points: to open up some new lines, to gain space, to alter the structure. And, you have to choose them judiciously, because, as has been said many, many times over the years, pawns don't move backwards, and once you push that pawn, there are going to be some things that you gain, but also some things that you lose in the process. Erod 1288 goes on to ask about this in the context of the hippo, which is the opening where black plays typically moves like g6, bishop g7, e6, d6, b6, a6, bishop b7, and the knights go into the center. And he wants to know, well, what should white do to kind of blast through this? And I would say about this opening that white needs to be very careful. And I think what players with white don't fully recognize is just how flexible black's position really is. Black's position is not bad. He's cramped. He's got less space. But in fact, it's not so bad for black because none of his minor pieces get in each other's way. The knights go into the center, the bishops get fianchettoed, and so the bishops both have clear diagonals, and everything is great. I mean, black only has the 3 ranks that he's operating on, but the thing to realize is that black has a wide choice of potential pawn breaks. So there's c5, there's d5, e5, f5. I mean, all of these, sometimes b5. All of these become available, and so white has to be really careful in the timing of his own attack, and to make sure that he doesn't make his own structure too inflexible. All right, another question from Erod 1288, and in a different direction, is this. So he asks, basically, what do you do about, or to fight against the mental domination of players who have done very well against you over the years? And to this I would say that there are basically 2 main cures. The first is to simply get better than them. And I think most of us who have kind of worked our way up have experienced that. So, if you're a youngster or you're new to the game, there may be some player who initially beats you up pretty good, but as time goes on and you improve, then you get better than they are, and the tables start to turn. But let's say it's someone, you've more or less kind of reached something close to your full potential, or at least as good as you're going to get given the time you spend at the game. What do you do against a player who's roughly your peer and who beats you much more often than the ratings would suggest that they ought to? Well, sometimes it just happens, and there's just no cure for it. But I think one thing that can be very helpful is, even if you're white, to try to get a quick draw, or just to get a draw against the player. So not try for revenge in every game, but simply stop the bleeding. So I had a series like that against an IM in New York that I did disproportionately badly against. I mean, he was a little bit higher rated than me, but not that much. I mean, not maybe 50 points higher rated than I am. So his score was better than it ought to have been. So, I had the chance to have this kind of perfunctory draw. We both clinched first in a little quad. And that actually worked wonders. So just the fact that, okay, even though it was, basically a nothing game, like 4 or 5 moves, whatever, the fact that, okay, I can say I drew my last game with so-and-so gives you a little confidence. So the player at least recognizes you as someone that he can't just, beat in 4 moves. I mean, of course he couldn't anyway, but you know what I mean. And also, the next time you play, he's thinking, okay, I didn't win the last game, right? The last game was a draw. So you're changing the memories here, and you have something positive that you can hold on to. And in fact, after a couple of, there was one more quick draw after this, the next time we played, I blasted him off the board. So it was, even though the 2 draws were quick, and I didn't really have to work very hard for them, or I didn't really have to work at all for them, to be more precise. Nevertheless, that just made the difference. So just stopping the bleeding, changing his own memory, the opponent's memory as well as your own memory, made a big difference, and gave me a little bit of confidence, changed the trend, and I was able to utilize that to my advantage. Okay, next question from Harbinger of Headache. In a perfect game of chess, do both players castle? Well, I suspect that there are actually many perfect games of chess, by which I mean games where neither player makes a mistake that would cost them half a point. And I suspect that there are just countless thousands of such games. And probably in many of them, both players castle, and in some of them, one or more doesn't. But who knows? Okay, next one. Luke in Arizona says, I rarely see the isolated queen pawn used as an advantage. Some games showing this would be interesting. Well, okay, that would go well beyond the point of this particular type of show here. I mean, I'm trying to answer various questions, and usually I'm presenting one game for a whole show. So presenting some games with that would be excessive. But really, this shouldn't be a very difficult thing to find at all. I mean, there are just countless games where the side with the isolated queen pawn wins. And So I'll just mention one variation where you can find, I think, plenty of examples. So let's say via the semitarish, though this can also arise via the Caro-Can and even the Nimzo-Indian, the position we're going to get to. Okay, so here bishop to d3 or bishop to c4. And okay, I would suggest that you look up, just for instance off the top of my head, a number of games by Vasily Smyslov, the former world chess champion. So there were 2 games in his 1983 candidates match against Zoltan Ribley that you can check out, where he had the isolated queen pawn and won in decisive and very impressive fashion. There's a game where he defeated Anatoly Karpov, I think from the 1971 Soviet Championship. In fact, I did a show on that for ChessBase. So if you're a member of the Play Chess server, you can look that up. And in fact, while I'm doing a little bit of quickie advertising, I'll mention my blog as well, chessmind.powerblogs.com. So take a look at that site as well, chessmind.powerblogs.com. Okay, so anyway, as I said, those 3 Smyslov games, also Smyslov against Ivanchuk from, I think, the 1988 Soviet Championship. I mean, just countless games. So, just one thing you can do, if you've got ChessBase or some other database program, stick this position in it, and just do a database search for positions, for games with this position where white wins. And you're bound to find plenty of examples, and they'll show, as you go through them, you'll see many themes that are common to isolated queen pawn positions that show that kind of structure in its best light from white's point of view. Okay, next question from, I'm not even going to try to say it. So he has 2 questions. The first one is about analyzing. How does one analyze and determine which is a better move? And he says, because as an amateur I get discouraged from analyzing my own games because I cannot determine if a move that I come up with is better than the one I actually played. And he gives an example. Okay, so let's take a look at this example. So this is a game where he's white. And we'll just kind of race forward to the critical position. Okay, here. And what he says is he's really not sure, should he play bishop to b2 here, or should the bishop go to g3? And he said, okay, about g3, let me get rid of that, that he was worried about something like, after bishop to g3, he's worried about g5, and then maybe h5, threatening to trap the bishop, although he thought maybe h4, g4, knight to d4, and so on would be good for white. Well, okay. In the game he chose bishop to b2, and actually I think this is probably the right move, but I think both are okay. I would prefer bishop to b2 just so that the squares on the queen side wouldn't be abandoned. So in this position, where let's say generally speaking after bishop to g3, there's maybe a slight weakness of these dark squares over here. All right, not such a big deal, won't be the end of the world, but it's at least a consideration. On the other hand, the bishop on g3 is pointing in a useful direction if black castles queenside. So definitely something to be said for either move. And one thing I can say about this that goes at least a first step towards answering his question is that if you've got a position where more than one move seems to be reasonable, then just pick one. It doesn't matter if Fritz says that one gives white a 1.1 advantage while the other one gives white only a 1.05 pawn advantage. I mean, who cares? Fritz can care about that, but there's no reason for us to. So if both moves look reasonable, just pick one, whichever one makes you feel more comfortable. So that's first. Secondly, there are always going to be gaps in our analysis. Kasparov has annotated games and subsequently checked them years later with the computer, and okay, sometimes he misses stuff. And sometimes he misses things that are strategical points as well, not even just tactical ones. So we're all flawed, but what we try to do when we're analyzing is, there are a number of things we can do. So one is, of course, and this is, I would say, most fundamental, especially for amateurs, is to figure out tactical errors. So, black's down a pawn. He should be looking to figure out, why did I lose this pawn? And and try to figure out, what was it about my game that led me to overlook this two-move combination here? Right. So after bishop to b5, he saw, okay, there's a threat to take the pawn on e5 maybe, and I can't defend it because there's a pin. But there's not just, it isn't saved by bishop to d7. You got to do something else to solve it. So you work your way backwards. So you see, okay, I'm in trouble at point at time t, so I want to go back to t minus n to figure out, well, where did I go from a position where I was okay to a position where I'm not okay? And this goes for strategic situations as well as simple tactics. If at one point you felt like you were about equal, and at some later point you feel like your position is just awful, even if material is still even, well, again, you work your way back. Try to figure out, well, okay, at t minus 1 move, is my position still lousy here? If so, well, keep going back. And, after you've really done the hard work of this, then it's okay, ask some other players, switch on the computer, but, try to basically go backwards, figure out where the key moment was, where the disaster took place. And even if you won, you should do that for your opponent, or if you lost some of your advantage along the way, figure out where you lost it. Something else you can do, and this applies especially in the opening and the middle game, is to look for structures that are similar. So if you had a certain kind of structure, going back to our isolated queen pawn setup, and let's say black got destroyed by a kingside attack, well, what you should do is look up games in the structure and see how players with black defended successfully against some of white's typical attacking ideas. Or conversely, if white lost because of the isolated pawn, you should look up games to see, well, what did white players do about that? How did they gain counterplay and avoid disaster? All right, so that's, I think, enough about this one. All right, so let's go on to another player's question. Okay, I have just one, and hopefully a simple question, says Strider67. At what point does an intermediate player shift gears from mainly studying and improving his tactics to a more positional, strategical training regime? And does that also include significantly more time on opening training as well? All right, so I'll give kind of a quick and superficial answer to this question, and a little bit of an arbitrary one as well, and just say when you're 1800. So I think, well, let me say this. I think there are really two stages that a player should go through tactically. The first stage is when you get to the point where you're no longer hanging pieces to one move attacks, or putting them into one move attacks. So that's the first, that you're cured of one move blunders. Okay, anyone can have some disaster sometime, but that it's extremely rare. It's not a part of every other game. So that's the first stage. The second stage is to get to the point where you're competent in basic tactical ideas like pins, forks, skewers, double attacks, discover check, all the stuff you find in elementary tactics books like Reinfeldt's 1001, winning combinations and sacrifices, or chess tactics for juniors, or any of these kind of fundamental elementary tactics books. So once you've got those kind of down, there's always going to be very complicated versions that could test even a grandmaster, but you basically see, okay, this is that kind of position. There should be a knight fork, or there should be some kind of double attack. Once you've got that down, then you're kind of ready to graduate to other topics. But really, until then, it's all right to look at a little positional chess. I think even once you're maybe 1300, a book like Jeremy Silman's How to Reassess Your Chess can be very useful, or Nimzovich's My System. But job one until then should be these fundamental tactics. Okay, Peter91 says, I have the tendency to screw up the last one or two rounds in a tournament. I play pretty well with the tournament, have got opportunities for a prize, and I play really bad in the last round. Is there a way to change this? Well, yeah, if you play really poorly in the last one or two rounds in the tournament, I would say drop out before those last rounds. Okay, I'm kidding. But no, I would say there's maybe one of two things that could be going on. So one, of course, is bad nerves. But the other possibility is that you simply run out of gas. So if it's a matter of a physical condition, then I would say get exercising. On the other hand, if it's bad nerves, then I would say maybe try to do something to relax before the game. So maybe do a little breathing exercise just to kind of calm yourself down, or listen to some music that gets you into whatever the kind of frame of mind that you have for the other games is, as best as you can. And all right, I mean that's about all I can suggest there. So try to be calm, or at least if you're nervous the other rounds, if you're let's say excited, then try to get back into that frame of mind. So maybe be consistent as well in whatever your pregame routines are. So whatever works for you in the earlier rounds, try to do the exact same thing for the later rounds. All right. So, okay, another question from Maddie92192. When analyzing an over-the-board game, is it more beneficial to use a computer or just look at yourself? Okay, I can't emphasize this enough. It's absolutely worthless to use a computer. In fact, that's the best way to make your chess worse. Okay, absolutely do not use a computer to analyze until you've milked the game yourself for almost everything you can. Yeah, I mean, using a computer to analyze for you is just atrocious. I mean, okay, I'm just going to say the same thing in more and more strong terms. So the point's clear. If you want to become weaker and weaker, use a computer all the time to analyze. If you want to get better, or at least maintain where you are, use your own brain, use your mind. The computer doesn't help you. The computer only helps at the very end to help you see where your blind spots are, and that's it. So work at it yourself. Okay, Dandy Dan asks, what can players of different skill levels hope or expect to gain from studying master games? Well, quite a lot. I mean, you get to see, first of all, I think there's kind of an osmosis effect that as you look at lots of master games, you start to see what good games are supposed to look like. So you see where pieces tend to go. If you think about it from the standpoint of openings or pawn structures, you get to learn what the typical plans are in certain openings or structures. By having an attitude of humility, too, this is really important. So if you're going over a player's game and you don't understand why they did it, well, that should be the occasion for you to try to figure out, well, what is the point of this? And really dig deep. Now, ideally what you should do, I think, is to analyze master games that have notes preferably by the winner, by the winner him or herself, and first try to do it as a solitaire exercise. So try to figure out one move at a time what the player played. So it doesn't matter, forget points. I mean, that kind of stuff is just a stupid gimmick. It doesn't matter how many points you get or what your imaginary ELO is based on this one game. All that does is motivate cheating and, let's say, excessive tension, and it gets the focus off of just trying to learn from the game. So forget that stupidity. Just get a raw game score. Let's say start from the point where you're out of what you consider to be book, and just write down the move. Spend time, give yourself a couple of hours to do it, an hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever. Write down the move that you think. Okay, when you're wrong, make a note of it, and then enter the player's next move. So it's a good way to do it is to do it using your computer, and if you have ChessBase, put it on the training tab so you can't see what the next move ever is. And so after you've made your guess, written it down, hit the arrow key, see what the player actually did, arrow key again to see what the opponent did, and back to guessing, and just go all the way through the game. So once you've done that, try to figure out why you got wrong what you got wrong, if you haven't already during the game. And after having done that, then look at the player's notes. Okay, so that will often be very illuminating. And after that, if you still have questions, then it's time to switch the computer on or to ask somebody, but not before that. Anyway, I think by doing that, you can gain tremendously. Okay, and then Dandy Dandy also asks, on a different note, what are some of your favorite chess-related books, videos, etc.? And on this, I'll just say, again, just too many to name. I mean, I like typically collections of games by the players themselves. So, Alyekin's Best Games by Alyekin, Fischer's 60 Memorable Games, that kind of book. Mikhail Tal's his own chess autobiography, that kind of book. You know, for me, I mean, I'm a big fan of Dvoretsky's books, and I also like Jacob Agard's books as well. But you know, opening books, I mean, okay, they're useful, they have their function, but that's not what I play chess for. I mean, okay, they can be interesting, they can be useful, but at the end of the day, I mean, who cares? You have to know what you have to know, and that's it. So it's, you know, looking at the games by the greatest players and really beautiful analyses. I mean, that's what gets me interested. Botvinnik's books on his own career and so on. So get books by the players themselves. They generally do a better job of analyzing. Of course, they know what they were thinking, and they'll usually do a better job of explaining it. And also, they tend to be just the strongest players around. So you'll get more from a book on Botvinnik's best games by Botvinnik than you will from somebody else, just because Botvinnik's a heck of a lot better player than they are. So anyway, I'll just leave it at that. Mentioning again on my blog, I frequently mention various books too, so people can check that out as well. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop here. Thanks a lot, everyone. Hope this was instructive, maybe entertaining at a few moments as well, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.